Everybody to confirm the names of each speaker and the order in which they're speaking, preferably in the chat, if that's okay. Thank you both. Could I also get someone to add the motion for me as well? Thanks. Okay, thank you for that. Can I get everybody in the room to turn their monitors on? Thank you.
Sorry, would it be possible to type the topic in the chat? I'm not sure if I'm unable to see it.
Right, okay, no worries. Can both the other adjudicators see the topic now? Great stuff. Okay, without any further ado, then I think we're all good to get started. Everybody's okay to start? Great. So I welcome everybody to this final round of the Seniors Archdale debating competition. First of all, I'd like to say a massive congratulations to both Askham and Kambala for making it this far. It's really exciting to have a grand final despite how late it is in the year. So we have Askham on the affirmative and Kambala on the negative. The affirmative team is from Askham and the speakers are first, Taylor, second, Margot, third, Taylor, and from Kambala on the negative, we have first, Lily, second, Katie, and third, Alex. I'm Dan, I'll be the chair today, and I'll get the other panelists to introduce themselves as well if they're able to do so.
Hi, my name's Arun.
How are you guys? I'm David.
Okay, so the speaking times for tonight's debate are 6 minutes to 8 minutes. The maximum speaking time is 8 minutes and 30 seconds. I won't jump in during your speeches to let you know of the intervals. So I encourage both all speakers to time themselves or have someone else in the room time them if they can. However, at 8 minutes and 30 seconds, I will jump in to let you know that your time has expired and to wrap up the speech. So the topic for tonight's debate is that global sports organisations should not get involved in national politics. And without any further ado, I welcome the first speaker of the affirmative.
Ladies and gentlemen, for far too long, sports has been corrupted by money. So before I begin, I would like to define sports organizations as organizations that have competitions in countries worldwide, for example, FIFA and the Olympics. We would also like to point out we are only talking about organization official bodies, not sports people competing under these organizational names. For example, under our model, cricket players would be able to boycott the South African, would be able to boycott going to sporting matches in South Africa under the apartheid, and this would be acceptable. We believe this is acceptable because we still have individual freedom of choice, and in this debate, we are rather tackling organizational corruption. We would also like to define involved as being donating to political parties, vocally saying that you like or dislike through the organizational name, receiving monetary incentives from national and receiving monetary incentives from the national parties. So on to my first speech, the incentives of global sport organizations. Global sport organizations often have corporate-like structures. For example, they're often driven by money, with the CEO up the top, with people pitching to them and bidding to them to host events. Because of this nature, they have incentives of the companies, with individuals, as I said, driven by money and personal motives. Usually also the head of the company has minimal sports background and is only looking to invest into the company to benefit them personally. Therefore, we believe this will create an atmosphere which is less concerned with the integrity of sport and more concerned with the short-term tangible results. For example, Qatar is hosting the 2022 World Cup, despite never have been able to play in the World Cup, and as well as having unideal weather conditions to host the World Cup. This is only happening because FIFA was paid extortionate amounts of money to have the World Cup in Qatar. So why is this bad? We have three responses to this. Firstly, it delegitimizes the actual sport organization. It becomes a competition as to who can pay sport teams the most money. Secondly, it gives unreasonable amounts of power to corrupt countries and political parties, which I'll explain later on in my speech. Thirdly, it doesn't necessarily align with favorable political outcomes. For example, those outcomes that prioritize human rights and freedoms will be denied. Instead, the sports companies will align with parties that are corrupt, usually oil rich, and that can pay them out the most. For example, this looks like parties in the Middle East who are human rights abusers, yet they have tons of money. So my second point is the ability to sway individuals and the world's response to sport. Sport organizations have a huge sway on people and cultures. And the way people view the decisions by sport organizations, they see them as legitimate, trustworthy decisions. So why is this? This is because we grow up with sport from a kid all the way through our lives. It's a childhood staple with, and is also intergenerational. So you have a blind faith and trust in the organization. Secondly, sport provides an embodiment of country values. For example, Australia, our sport culture is that we're all loyal mates to each other. So it becomes a way to connect groups of people despite differences. In other words, through sport, you become a community without the knowledge of the inner workings of the community. Because of this strong inner working and high degree of personal interest of sport, it allows individuals to be easily swayed. Even if countries and individuals disagree with the political decisions of sport organizations, we acknowledge that individuals are very unlikely to stand up. So why is this? This is because of four reasons. One, there is a large mob mentality within sport, which means individuals are likely just to go with the collective and not stand up. Secondly, the intergenerational trust makes individuals turn a blind eye to the often not good decisions that sport organizations will make. Thirdly, the power of sport in people's lives. Sport competitions often happen every 4 years, so people are very unlikely to turn down the opportunity to go to these sport events just because of political alignment. This is because with sport, people make a career out of it, they get fame and also large amounts of money. Fourthly, countries want global recognition for this opportunity for themselves to establish in a global area. They invest large amounts of money in sport programs, and as such, they're just not going to forfeit the competition because of political alignment. We would also like to note sport is seen as a relaxing community environment. This means that viewers are not watching sport to scrutinize and analyze the incentives and decisions that are made. They're there to simply enjoy the entertainment. And on to my third point. Why is this bad for long-term politics? This is bad because it simply legitimizes corrupt regimes. For example, back to the Qatar example, whoever is in power can exploit the fact that they are hosting the FIFA World Cup, saying that FIFA was allowed to be hosted in their country just because of their good ruling, when it was actually rather that FIFA got paid a significant amount of money to host it there. It's also bad because it takes away people's ability to make individual decisions because of the blind faith and intergenerational trust that we have in these companies, as I already mentioned. Individuals then begin to lose their voice in politics, making more room for corruption. Additionally, this is bad because it will disproportionately affect smaller countries who don't necessarily have large amounts of money that they can associate with companies like FIFA, who are significantly money hungry. This will create a disproportional imbalance globally, denying people the right to play sport, which we believe everybody should have. And that is why I am proud to affirm. Thank you.
I thank the first affirmative speaker for that speech and now welcome the first negative speaker.
Can you hear me all right? Within this debate, we believe the opposition talked a lot about how they care about corruption and they care about the inherent corporation style of sports organizations, how they're driven by greed and how they care so much about integrity. Note that at no point in opposition's speech did they actually talk about how their model is going to help fix that integrity. At no point did they say how they were going to fix their example about Qatar and how we're still going to be playing FIFA in Qatar. At no point did they actually recognize how they're going to make any change. They just made an observation that sometimes sports organizations are corrupt. We are the side that will offer you tangible change, actual political change, no matter how small, that the opposition cannot offer you within this debate at all. So within this debate, I will first be doing some rebuttal onto the opposition's main point about the corruption in sports organizations. So firstly, the opposition talks a lot about how the inherent corporate structure of sports organizations, where it's driven by money and personal motive, means that they're less concerned with integrity and more concerned about money. And so they kind of just talked about this a lot. And it gave a lot of examples about why this is a bad thing. And so yes, we do believe corruption is a bad thing. But firstly, we also believe that we could also go against corruption, because we believe that within this debate, if the opposition has the political capital to ban organizations from taking any steps ever in national politics, we believe we also have some sort of capital to try to combat the corruption which is occurring. But even if there was corruption, the opposition didn't really substantiate why there was corruption in these organizations, such rampant corruption, besides the fact that they can point to a few instances of it. We believe you can't really pay people off if there's a genocide occurring in your country. You'll notice how North Korea still wasn't allowed to participate in the Olympics because of their horrible human rights abuses. With more niche things that people aren't as aware about, it's more difficult to be able to claim that same thing. We also believe that even if they are a corporate business, they still rely on their viewership and approval of those viewers. So if they're clearly taking money to hide human rights abuses, we believe that would just not be in the best interest of the sports organizations anyway. So at that point, you can't believe that the corruption that the opposition is talking about is that bad anyway. And then also, once again, note how they haven't said how they'll fix that at all within this debate. So now on to my substantive within this debate. So just some minor setup. We believe that our motion within this debate is an extension of the status quo, because we believe becoming involved in national politics looks like strong public statements condemning the behavior within a country. For example, the WTA criticizing China for detaining its tennis star. It also looks like excluding countries from sports, for example, excluding North Korea from the Olympics, or thirdly, supporting local movements or charities within a country. So we also believe that national politics within space is likely to look like big moral, social issues like human rights violations or environmental issues. Note that we don't believe that this is going to be like highly partisan issues like supporting like the Liberal Party in Australia. We believe it's probably going to be like oppressive dictators or like quite massive issues within the debate. I think that's fair to assume. So now on to our substantive within this debate. So firstly, a principle. So the opposition, the lack of action about issues that we're characterizing is relevant in scope of this debate in terms of like human rights abuses, because we believe that allowing going into a country where there's human rights abuses being perpetuated and still participating in them and not acknowledging them is actively condoning and actively being complicit in those actions. And we believe that's like a principally bad thing. And so why is it like the responsibility of global sports organizations in these circumstances? So we believe that sports organizations directly benefit from countries' oppressive actions by endorsing them. And so we believe, like, for example, a lot of money goes into like holding Olympics in the country that it's being held in. Like they get a lot of money from tourism and like just a lot of awareness within their country. And so we believe like when they held massive sports events in like South Africa during the apartheid, or when they held the 1939 Olympics in Nazi Germany, we believe that was like actively condoning what the behavior that was being had there, where by just allowing it to continue anyway. And so we believe that not doing something is actually an act of harm that they must like say that is like a bad thing. And so we've also believed that because sports has such a huge significance to people, because it's like people have like a generational connection to it. It's like the epitome, like sports seen as like the epitome of fairness. And there's like a lot of cultural importance in sport. That means that like, because they have like so many viewers and such connection to their viewers, they have a particular responsibility when they are with their behavior to show that they're not being complicit in like horrible human rights violations. And so at the end of that, we believe like the idea of like with great power comes great responsibility. Like you have to actually be able to act when you have this much power and that much influence over people. And so we believe overall a lack of action is morally harmful within this debate. And so if the opposition wants to ban any sort of action, because now on their side, you should note that there is no potential for any action to occur, you're actually preventing any good from happening and you're actively condoning the behavior, full stop. And so now onto our practical material within this debate. So firstly, how will sports organizations doing this create important political change? So firstly, why are sports organizations likely to criticize like human rights violations and other important social issues over like other things? So we believe that because sports organizations aren't really grounded in political issues like as like an international body, we believe that it's likely they'll target big like relatable social issues or issues that are important to athletes. Like for example, like very obvious things that are happening like genocide or like because a lot of like there's a lot of POCs in sports, it's likely that they're going to want to like represent issues and like things that their athletes are also passionate about. And so we also believe, secondly, that they're more likely to target fundamentally wrong things. So this wouldn't mean that like they're focusing on like tiny like fights between political parties. It's more like actually like big things that people care about. And thirdly, like because of the big left-wing pressure like coming from social media and like just social media in general, this means that they don't want to like exclude a major part of their audience and like their viewership. So we believe that they're likely to focus on big important issues. Note that because this is like global sports organizations, it's unlikely to be controlled by like the political incentives of any particular country, because they're just like an international group. So it's like it increases the ability to criticize countries and organizations who are otherwise may not be criticized. So secondly, why are sports organizations so powerful within this debate? So we believe that we have 4 reasons for this. Firstly, they have a lot of money and resources because of like sponsorships, media coverage rights for the things that they're advertising. Secondly, like media, they have millions of viewers and supporters around the world. Thirdly, these supporters are often like intrinsically linked to their identity to sports. Like for example, like in India and Australia, like it's a national pride to play cricket, or like local, and even on like local teams that are competing on like big scales, like that's still really big to you because you've like grown up watching that team. And then fourthly, the perception of sports as like the great equalizer kind of makes sports seem as like the fair body where people are like they are the objective power, like objective power. So at the end of that, you know that sports organizations are actually really powerful bodies that people really care about. And so why is it likely that when sports organizations act, that they're likely to affect political change in a very meaningful way? So I'll just run you through a few mechanisms of how this would work. So for example, like economic dependency on the support of sports. So we believe like holding the Olympics, for example, generates billions of dollars for the country what's being held in. Like for example, like sponsorships and media coverage and like tourism in general. We believe that because like people already invest so much money at like building stadiums in preparation for big sporting events. So when you take away that like their ability to interact in those sporting events or like host the Olympics or to be able to interact in that event at all, that means that that's a massive economic incentive that people have to want to change their behavior. Because if the Olympics say like, unless you stop your behavior, you can't participate. They're now losing billions of dollars that they really need for their country. And so we believe that like that's a huge incentive that they have within this debate. We believe secondly, another mechanism is like the international reputation being damaged. So the opposition also talked about how it's really important for countries to have sport and like to be represented. We believe that like this, like for example, like in the Olympics, how North Korea is not allowed to participate, but their athletes were allowed to participate. This meant that they couldn't claim any of that pride or nationalism for their country, which is actually a massive thing in the global theater, because that means that they are now not being recognized for it at all. And so we believe that's another incentive. Thirdly, we believe that there's a lot of awareness and support that can be generated from the sports organizations' actions. We believe that if fans see sports condoning something that they like, because they care about sports so much, if they see them condoning an issue, they're likely to be driven to action as well, because not only are they just not only are they now aware of this issue, but now they feel like they should be making action. So at the end of this, you know that this is like, these are big political important issues being solved. And even at our worst, we're only generating awareness, but at our best, we're actually actively stopping these political injustices from happening, whereas the opposition can offer you none of these benefits on any side of the world. Thank you.
I thank the first negative speaker for that speech, and now welcome the second affirmative speaker to continue their team's case.
Nothing.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Okay. I'll be asking 3 questions in this speech. Firstly, what sort of political issues would international sports organizations actually engage with? Secondly, what would this mean for politics and individuals under oppressive regimes? And thirdly, what is the impact of this policy on the integrity of sports, and how is this harmful to individuals? Note that that last question is a point and substantive. So just to clarify before we started, they said that we didn't give any mechanisms. I'd just like to clarify that that was some of the setup we actually gave you at first. So what we were against was firstly releasing official statements in favor of or against political ideas or political parties within participation nations. Secondly, you couldn't give donations to political parties or political organizations. And thirdly, you couldn't accept any donations. We think they could just publish reports or something like that. We could still get transparency on our side. Okay, so then who would these sports organizations actually be targeting? They wanted to tell you that, well, they would be targeting like human rights abuses because they cared about human rights and they had like a public platform that they would use. But we tell you no. Why is this, right? Firstly, we tell you the characterization we gave you at first, because a lot of the people under these organizations aren't actually sports people. We see this like a lot of clubs are owned by, right, like businessmen, or a lot of international organizations are run as CEOs. And as such, it's then run as a company, and they're likely to prioritize their own personal interests, and they're likely to then, you know, actually just like take payouts from certain countries. And also here, like they wanted to say that, oh, well, they call out human rights abuses, but we think that's just like not really the case in the status quo. We think that they can still be complicit with human rights abuses. For example, like the Winter Olympics is still being held in China, despite everyone knowing that they like have Uyghur people locked up in camps. The Olympics aren't really doing anything about that because China has a lot of political sway, and they're a really, really important country that China necessarily needs to engage with in order to be seen as like, that Olympics needs to engage with in order to be seen as legitimate. China has a lot of money and can pitch really well. So that means that even if they want to target like human rights abuses, they're only going to target it in very, very small countries that people aren't probably going to be looking at. They're not going to be targeting huge issues like China. They could maybe do a small statement, but that's in their best case scenario where people are actually incentivized by like human rights, which we told you was unlikely to happen. And we told you that was unlikely to happen because you were likely to have backlash and pressure from huge companies and countries
and political parties. That was never going to happen. So then, why could we still get political action under our side? We told you here that there's a distinction between having political organizations putting their name to say good stuff about like a corrupt political party and having actual individuals. So note here that like their example about China and the tennis and the woman getting locked out, we could still have political action under our side because we could still have someone like Djokovic coming out and saying, hey, China's locking people up. That was a distinction we made. We still had people having their personal platforms. And note here as well, we think this is probably like more empowering, right? Because you're more likely to listen to a sports individual because you're likely to have a following, they've got ads, they have a bigger fan base rather than potentially like an official statement from an organization. So that meant we could still get the benefits because we still had individuals engaged politically if they wished that to be the case. Okay, now then, on to my point in substantive. How does this impact the integrity of sports and why is this harmful to individuals and politics? So firstly, a bit of setup. What should sports actually look like? Firstly, we tell you it should be community-based, everyone should be engaged. Secondly, it should be enjoyable and for entertainment. Thirdly, it should be fostered around ideas of acceptance. That is to say, despite nationality, race, gender, etc., you should be accepted. And fourthly, it should be about having the best sports quality possible. So what does their side mean for individuals and sports? And note here that there's like a bit of nuance in this argument. It's to say that like people may be against the decisions of sports organizations to align with potentially corrupt ideas, but that they would still participate because what we told you at first is that if you're training for your entire life, you're not likely to go against that organization because you still have an alliance to them and that's your entire job. What then does that mean to like individuals in their world who have to align with corrupt institutions? Firstly, we tell you that you're going to have inner conflict and guilt. For example, if you're a football player playing in like a FIFA stadium that was built by like unethical labor, you're going to feel terrible and your performance is necessarily then going to be impacted. And that places a huge burden on individual sport people. And we think that's really harmful. And secondly, to minorities especially, they want us to talk about minorities, saying how there are a lot of minorities in sport and they would be empowered by organizations. But we tell you no. In fact, what they would do is they would feel disempowered because they bind back into organizations that are like inherently corrupt. For example, like if you're an ethnic minority person playing in China, you're going to feel really bad because like China is still hosting Olympics and stuff, and that's really bad on your conscience. We think that we should prioritize like the minorities within this debate, and we think they shouldn't have to feel like they're participating in an event that goes against their very existence. And the impact of this is that we think that the integrity of sports will be compromised, and we want an environment where people can feel free to play the best as they can, to have the best performance. Okay, so note here then, like let's engage with that best case scenario. Their best case scenario is that like you have good politics, right? Sure, but we tell you that these harms still exist because politics is inherently divisive. You're always going to have people who don't engage with your political causes. So that means you're always going to have people who have guilty conscience necessarily. And note here, like we could still get the impacts of good politics on an individual level or through other organizations. We just didn't want to impact the performances of individual sports people. So what would our world actually look like then? Our world would look different for two groups of people. Firstly, for people who are apolitical or didn't want to align with politics, you wouldn't have to feel guilty and you wouldn't have to implicitly support politics you didn't agree with, even if they were seen to be good by the majority. We still think you have you can be allowed to hold your own political views and not have that intersect with sports that was meant to be based on enjoyment. And secondly, for people who are really political and were always politically inclined. A few things to say here. Firstly, is that they could still engage with political platforms through the platforms they've gotten in sports. For example, you can still post things on your social media. You can still have ad campaigns to support things that you cared about within sports. We think that that's like quite empowering for individuals. What you're not doing is you're not degrading like an organization's name, and you're not forcing everyone under that organization to then align with the political movements. You still have your own social media platforms and things under our world. We could get similar action using all the characterization we told you about the impact of sports. But that was so important because that empowered the individual to express their own views. And that was really important for minorities as well, because we empowered them to have their own platform. And this looks like in the status quo, having, people kneeling at Black Lives Matters protests before football. We think that's incredibly empowering for minorities. So this is empowering the individual. What we were always against was politics that was swayed by international organizations paid out by corrupt and wealthy and immoral political figures. And we recognize that maybe in some scenarios there would be good political incentives, but we didn't want to risk it because all it took was like having one World Cup held in somewhere that was incredibly corrupt, and you were going to have tons of people there getting tons of money, and that regime was going to be legitimate. So that sort of cancelled out all the good outcomes they wanted to tell you. We could get those good outcomes on an individual level. What we didn't want to do is we didn't want to legitimize terrible, terrible regimes. Therefore, I'm so proud to affirm.
I thank the second affirmative speaker for that speech, and now welcome the second negative speaker.
Can you hear me? The reason the opposition loses its debate is because they point out one issue and then fix a different one, which is entirely unrelated. Because the World Cup is going to be held in Qatar, even if an individual speaks up. They don't stop it being held in this country. The Olympics can still be held in China. What the opposition does is remove the mechanism that the Olympics had beforehand. She now said we don't want to hold them in China. Because what the opposition doesn't understand is because the place an Olympics is held, or the place a sports organization holds their kind of cup of the season, is not determined by being paid off by one party, which is fundamentally misunderstands how sports work. Because if that is how it works, all these people who care about sports, as I think we've both agreed in this debate, they would absolutely go wild about this because everybody believes sport is the epitome of fairness. Note that the way that these are chosen is quite transparent in the first place. Also, the reason these are held is again totally opposed to what the opposition says. So at the end of this, what do we know? We know that likely what is going to happen is under the opposition's world, we have these kind of discussions about how they're held, and now it is only going to be held in China. Under our world, we are the world in which we can say it is a political act now to not hold it in China. That is the point of this debate, and that's why we're ahead. There are three questions I'm going to ask in this speech. The first is just an issue of clarifying the incentives and the models of each team. The second is a question of who acts better in these terms, organizations versus individuals. And thirdly, it's a point about the politicization of sports, which I'm going to talk about as my substantive. So in the first question about basically clarifying what this speech means, the opposition basically comes out with a model that they're against official statements and donation from parties. We have to note that this does not address the issues they talk about, as I flagged in my introduction. This doesn't stop the kind of systems that work. We believe the government still benefit from things like tourism. There are donations from sponsors. There's support from fans, which is the reason and the way that these are held. We believe that this therefore is kind of irrelevant. Then we also want to talk about the incentives, because the opposition only really points out one incentive. They talk about corporate structure and they kind of assert corruption is going to happen. We think this is an incredibly limited view. We tell you there are many other ways that this happen, which we tell you at first speaker. We tell you this is media, viewers, and sponsors. Note how all three of them are susceptible to public opinion, because the public, because they love sport, that is the reason. If there was blatant corruption going on, and as the actual system in which the opposition's world it functions, then how on earth are you going to be able to support money? Because the reason why sport has money is because its fans endorse it in the first place. Note how important this flaw in the opposition's characterization is in the context of the wider debate. We think this is important for two reasons. Firstly, because it massively reduces this corruption argument, because we believe that the only logic they had was that money is involved and therefore corruption. We also say that we have the capital to address this because they are going and banning things, so therefore we are ahead. We believe, secondly, this characterization also strongly aligns with us, because even if it acts like a corporation, you still see corporations making things like a stance on like Me Too, or like a stance on Black Lives Matter. So because of these like drivers are reliant on having trust, we believe firstly, although many believe it's important, like sport is incredibly important, we believe the media and other people in broader society are likely to hit back against these kind of things. And we believe secondly, if sports are so good, people want to protect them. Ultimately, what does this therefore mean the kind of world we are talking about looks like? We believe appeasing the public and the media is a major driver. We think it's unrealistic for the opposition to assert that the only reason, the only way that sports function is by donations from dictatorships, which is a weird way to approach this debate. We believe, therefore, also, even if the opposition has proven that some of these bodies that decide World Cups are bad, they have no logic to prove why they therefore cannot make a stance on, for example, a genocide happening in a different country. Like, why is it that if a country is like slightly corrupt, they can't therefore, like the WTA, talk about the fact that China is actively suppressing a Me Too spokesperson from tennis? Like, that logic makes absolutely zero sense. It is incredibly unrelated. Even if they're not the best actor, that is still a powerful actor, which is important as we move on to the next question in the speech about organizations versus individuals. So we tell you out at second speaker that the mechanisms we get for change are the economic dependency of people on sport through revenue, investing money. We believe the international reputation is incredibly important, pride in country that gives sport as equality. Thirdly, support and awareness, that's like they think it's important. And fourthly, actively giving money for these kind of things. We believe that the reason why sports are so important and these actual bodies making the stances in the first place is important is because they have all these things on a scale that one person cannot by themselves. We also think that these two bodies are not just a comparison. We think we are able to enrich the ability for individuals to speak up if we are able to equip the organization to make political statements. We have this all like from like an empirical level. We can see like when Colin Kaepernick kneeled, it was because the NFL was against him that no change was able to happen. We see that like you're less likely to speak up when your sport is considered apoliticized, so therefore you're encroaching on this kind of sacred ground by including this. That is something that I'll elaborate later in the speech. We also believe that by not being backed by the organization, you might like not like have a sense of being by yourself. You don't want to speak up because it's kind of scary for you and your thing, and also it seems like opposed to by the organization. We also want to point out how little the impact that an individual can have compared to like a massive organization. Because okay, like one tennis player can say one thing, but if it's the actual tennis organization, you have so many more resources to do things like donate to charities. You have so many resources to do things like build public awareness. These are things the opposition never gets under their world. Also note that the speaking up of athletes is not mutually exclusive under their side. It is, although we would argue it's enriched under our side, at worst, we still get these kind of speaking up in their world. At the end of this, what do you really know? So the opposition's kind of case in this way is saying that organizations are corrupt and therefore cannot make good stances on politics. No, they only go for like a dictatorship paying off an organization and ignore the fact that this also looks a lot more of the time in order to appease the public, like things like speaking up against like literal genocides, because that encaptures their audience and that brings them towards them and gets them more money, as the opposition stresses with this corporate style kind of argument. The individualist argument the opposition wants to tell you is going to be so much less effective, and so much less effective, especially because they no longer have the backing of their organizations. This then brings me to my point of substantive about the politicization of sports. So basically what I'm saying in this argument is two things. Firstly, I'm saying that the opposition shifts the perception of sport and politics as separate entities and therefore disempowers players and others from critiquing sport as political organizations. So on this first kind of idea, we believe that shifting perception of sport and politics in the opposition's world, they broadcast this narrative that sports are apolitical bodies. Because note, we are talking a world that is like an extension of the status quo. They're talking about a world in which there are no more statements. There are no more statements from the WTA about like the abuses of like Me Too and then like rape in like China. We believe that these like are important issues. We believe these representative bodies are literally unable to speak. They're cracking down on their ability to say what they want to say. We believe this is fundamentally wrong because this narrative they're projecting is false. Because sports are political, it is political where it is held, and it's not about paying off by a dictatorship. We believe it's political as who is counted as a country, who can play, and like holding your flag in itself is an act of like a political act. Why is this important? The opposition's world where sport and politics are separate, they are removed from each other in the dialogue. This means that they disempower players and other critique of sports. This is because we believe that viewing it as an apolitical institution stops discussion about political issues. We believe that in the status quo, which we are going to be extending on under our side, we are seeing, like for
For example, increasing dialogue about trans people in sports, because sport itself has become a political issue, political arena. We see the discussion about Margaret Court being a TERF. We like think of things about people of color and like sports and about like sponsorships and race. These kind of discussions happen a lot less under the opposition side because firstly, there is like less normalized sports and politics being like essentially intertwined, which means you get less interest. We believe also you face the argument that probably by the right that sports are apolitical. At the end of this speech, what do you know? The opposition's world, while they profess to stop it being held in China, there is no reason or mechanism that is going to function. We believe we're the only side that can stop these these things from happening in like countries that are doing such harm. Therefore, we are so proud to negate.
I thank the second negative speaker for that speech and now welcome the third affirmative speaker to conclude their side of the debate.
Good evening. The main issue in this debate that I think both sides are having a big issue agreeing upon is the characterization of sports and the actual whether this characterization has had a tangible effect in the real world. So this will lead me into my 2 points. One, the characterization of sport organizations, their incentives and their like effect on people. And two, the effect on politics and human rights, things like that. So on to the first issue is that like, are sports organizations corrupt? What are their incentives? How do their viewers react to this? So first of all, they've asked us, why is there corruption? And we believe that, as we've said in our first and second speaker speech, sports organizations are run like businesses, and just as businesses, they are not caring about, the little people at the bottom of their food chain. They are caring about how much money can they make, what is in the name for it. So big organizations, to go locally, for an example, local rugby clubs such as the Roosters or the Manly Seagulls are run by people that have no sort of knowledge about the game, and they're literally business owners that thought, oh, I'll invest a couple million because they have the money and it gives them a name for themselves. So now they pay off all the the drug busts, and they pay off the rape claims and the misogyny because they can. It's not to do with, they're not focusing on the human resources. They are focusing on how can we make the club look better for ourselves. And these things often don't even get out to the public because they pay off, they pay off the media and they pay off people that stop these issues from escaping to the public. So the negative team has come out and said they rely on viewership and support, and therefore they won't be corrupt. However, as I said before, these companies are huge organizations. If FIFA says to the Sunday Telegraph, we don't want you to print this, and pays them enough money, the Sunday Telegraph won't print it. So if there has been some human rights thing that they have so much control over people that if there's a human rights issue that they don't report on, like no one's gonna. So yeah, they'll be corrupt because they have the ability to control other people, and that is not creating a free and equal platform. And they have said that they are very responsible, and we agree that they have a huge sway on the sort of our citizens and our population, but this is why they are not responsible. Because when you're watching the sport, when you go on and you're flicking through the sports papers and it says like, oh, FIFA has sponsored the release of people from concentration camps in China, you're not really in the mindset to be like, okay, why do this? Or if you see FIFA is now the World Cup is being hosted in Qatar, and you're not thinking, now, why is that happening? You just think, okay, whatever, move on. Your brain is in the mind of, what organizations do I agree with? What are my morals aligning with? You've been raised to just believe whatever they say, and therefore you're not questioning, you're not scrutinizing, and nothing is going on. And therefore, and also, we'd like to say that people have had these sports organizations have the ability. So the negative team has come out and said, like, the sports organization is so good because they're not corrupt and they've done all these things for the world. However, I'd like to say that this is not true. They have had multiple abilities. For example, the Adam Goodes incidents, where he was literally called an ape on his own playing field. What did the AFL do? Did they, stop the AFL? Did they take away the bills? No. Adam Goodes was forced to leave the stadium because there was no compensation for him. There was no support. There was nothing. The girl who had called him an ape, she was now the victim. All the sports people, because it was this institutionalized ideas within the sport that, they've said it is the equalizer or whatever. Politics is not the same as who can get a ball through the hoop. There is so much more to it. And this is why the sports organization should not be responsible for politics, because they don't have the world view and they don't have the understanding of politics and things that allows for this. They are simply involved in their own ideas and their own thing. And so we've said they're not a good equalizer because, as I've said, not everything can be solved in the same way as sports. And if anything, it creates more of a divide because now you have people that are like, oh, maybe the sport organization should be signing up for this, maybe they shouldn't. And then you have this divide in the sport, which is not what we want. So in their best case scenario, in the negative team best case scenario, we have a sports organization that has the power to do things, yet they don't do it. Because as we've seen in real life events, they don't do it. The Olympics was hosted in Germany in 1936, where literally the Nazi regime was beginning to arise and nothing happened. For example, China has been allowed to compete at the Olympics. Nothing has happened. Russia, they tried to stop Russia after the whole scandal drug steroids bust. However, Russia still competed. They just changed their name. We have seen sports organizations fail and fail again. And so whilst they have this power, they're not doing anything, and rather they're just accepting the money and they're accepting the corruption, and that's all. And in their worst case scenario, yeah, the corruption involves heaps. There's a huge divide in sport. It becomes this politics. It divides the country rather than brings them together, and it's horrible. And also like to talk about the culture surrounding sports. That whilst it is very mating, like friendly and things like that, it is also very violent. You hear of protests and things, around World Cup time, around Olympics time, where people are more racist than ever. They're more aggressive than ever. Kids are getting bashed for wearing sports jerseys to schools. And also, they've said that the fans are supporting these corporations, these organizations. That's not true. Fans account for maybe the tiniest proportion of it. They are sponsored by big sponsors. It's Telstra or it's, Optus. I don't know why I'm saying all networks, but it is sponsored by these huge networks and these huge corporations that also have no interest in human resources, because the sport isn't the ones bringing attention to it. And so therefore they're not being held accountable because no one knows about it anyway. So they have no interest in bringing attention to it. And therefore they only care about the money because that is what they're in it for. So now on to the second issue, which is the effect on politics. So they have said that they'll target like huge political change and relatable social issues, and that like it'll target the fundamentally wrong issues. However, we believe that they do not care about political change enough, as I've said, due to the history that we have seen. So they've characterized the political change that will occur as these huge drastic changes. We'll have dictators being brought down because the sports will bring attention to it. I hate to tell you that this doesn't happen. We've had the power to do this in the present or in the past, and it has not happened. Rather, we've had countries divided, we've had sports institutions taking advantage of it and becoming corrupt. And then the second point under this is that sport often has the mob mentality and the means of the platform for human rights. However, we decrease the human rights almost, as this Adam Goodes example, because if they've said it'll create a positive effect, we had the platform to create a positive effect, and what did we do? We diminished it. We didn't do that. And we'd also like to say that they've said that like the power and the effect of like the sports organization, if someone hosts the Olympics, that gives them money to them. By taking away this incentive, they lose their power and things like that. And they gave the example of North Korea. However, we like to say that there's tragedies in North Korea that are so inherently bad that we're not doing anything about, because North Korea isn't allowed to compete in the Olympics. North Korea doesn't come to this, and they don't do that, and we're not allowed in North Korea anymore. And they've become this segregated little bubble at the end of the world that no one can go into. There's like blocked tours out. No one knows what's happening in there. And this segregation is what's going to happen when we start to like kick people out of here and kick people out of there. There's no accountability. If you can't go into, if everyone boycotts the South African game during the apartheid. If you can't even go into the country, how can you see what's happening? How can you see things like that? We need sport to be inclusive, and we think this will in fact bring more accountability to things and have a bigger issue, because if people are able to not think politically about the game they're going to, then they can get rid of all their prejudices and get rid of all their biases and go to the country and think, okay, I'm here for the sport, but what's the other issue? And not intertwine those things. Sport and politics doesn't intertwine well because it's a laid back, sort of relaxed, fun thing, and this huge moral and integrity issue that don't align. And then they have said that it stops the injustices, and we've said, as we've said, so there's better ways to stop the injustices, and this is through the like the actual sports people and not the sports institution. And so this is true for 4 reasons. So first of all, these sports people have millions of followers who are all dedicated fans. They have the money, but they're not getting as many incentives from other people, so they know it's doing the right thing. They can see better collective action. For example, the apartheid players, that was so successful because it was not the organization. Oh, thank you. That's why I'm proud to
I thank the third affirmative speaker for that speech, and now welcome the third negative speaker to conclude the debate.
Can you hear me? The problem with this opposition team is they have fundamentally failed to be comparative in this debate. Because no, even at our worst, and sports organizations don't criticize every single human rights abuse, they have the power to criticize some, and the opposition can never change that. The opposition wanted to talk about how the World Cup is held in China and Qatar. The whole point is, under their side, they do not have the capacity to change it, because excluding a country is an inherently political act. The opposition shoots themselves in the foot where they claim that we don't target everything, but by definition, they can make no political stand. Secondly, their emphasis on athletes was a bit strange, because say they have athletes on their side, we have athletes plus sports institutions. So that, again, that was like another failure to be comparative, and is ultimately why negative wins this debate. Okay, so in this debate, I'm going to do two things. Firstly, I'm going to look at like the principle, which we have had zero response to. Secondly, I'm going to look at the practical of who gets political change. So firstly, about the principle, this is basically whipping, because again, no response. We tell you firstly that sport, like by doing nothing, you're inherently condoning bad acts. We tell you that sport always has to be a bit political. For example, the Olympic people hold their flags. We tell you that like a sport is considered the great equalizer. It's about equality. So when the opposition prevents sports organizations from speaking out against like human rights abuses, they are essentially condoning every single horrible act that could occur. Secondly, we tell you like undermines these organizations' freedom of speech. Like any other institutions, they have the right to like express their political beliefs inherent to the democratic system. Why were these principles so important? Firstly, and why were they important to the debate? Firstly, because the scale we won this problem by was very large, because we didn't actually hear a response that meant it could tip any balance the opposition wanted to do. But secondly, we think that for a sports body to have no choice but to always condone horrible human rights abuses, to condone people being like locked up in places like China, to even condone genocide was such a huge and horrible principled mistake for them in this debate. But now let's move on to the point which like had more airtime in this debate, which is the practical argument. Okay, so basically this kind of ended up being like staked on the incentives of sports organizations organizations. So we thought generally this is classified into three things. So firstly, the opposition tells you that like sports organizations are like motivated by money and they're like particularly corrupt. So we have like two main responses to this. Firstly, as we tell you down the bench to no response, that we uniquely are the only side that has the capacity to deal with corruption in these sporting industries, because we have the political capital and the fiat that the opposition has from implementing their model. That means that we uniquely were the only side that could claim to fix this opposition problem opposition cared about. But secondly, even if we were to accept these organizations were influenced by money, it was not from countries like China. It was more likely to be from like viewership, from like media paying the rights to sponsorship, and like companies and sponsors. So this is why this like completely neutralizes the opposition's argument that like therefore they don't criticize big countries like China. Because firstly, we think money from countries will always be less than like countries from viewership, sponsorships, and media for like three reasons. Firstly, if because bidding for like a sporting event only happens like once every 4 years for the Olympics. So it was completely like crazy to say that all of the money was from countries in this like very small window of time. Secondly, we thought often multinational corporations had a lot more money than a lot of these nations did, which uniquely meant they could like invest. And thirdly, we thought getting money from countries for sponsorships was not sustainable in long term, whereas sponsorships and media rights like inherently were. Secondly, we thought they still, even if they did get money from these kinds of big countries, they were still likely to criticize them, because any one individual country was unlikely to have a big impact, right? We thought that even if China withdrew their funds, we thought they still had like huge like economies like the US, like America, like a lot of European countries that could easily make up for it. So it was unreasonable to say that the entire organization would be swayed by just one nation. But thirdly, we thought countries had a lot more to lose in this equation, because sport uniquely had such a big platform in society. It was considered a way to express your national pride, show the supremacy of your country, like compete on like a fair playing field. And also many of these countries had often invested and had a lot of money in these kinds of ideas. So we thought if anything, these countries are more likely to be swayed than organizations and vice versa. So we hear a few responses to the opposition on this. Firstly, they tell you that like these companies are also corrupt. However, we tell you all companies inherently depend on buy-in and like the people's support to like sell any kind of product that relies on people buying it. And if people boycotted it because they were like forcing a sports organization like to support human rights abuses, just like which is completely like silly. But also we thought companies didn't have an incentive really to support a dictatorship in a random country. So that kind of line was like a bit like unclear and like really didn't stand in this debate. The second response we hear is that like these countries sporting companies like control the media. The problem with this, I think they misunderstood, because it was the other way around. It was that they got the sport companies got money from media rights to like, for example, for Seven to broadcast the Olympics, and that is where a large part of their funding was. Therefore, the opposition's corruption case fell down because firstly, we didn't think corruption was a big issue because they fundamentally misunderstood the monetary corruptions of like many countries. But secondly, even if corruption did exist, we uniquely were the only side that had the capacity and political capital to fix it. Something was never criticized by the opposition. And thirdly, even at their best, if they failed to criticize some powerful countries, we still had a net benefit here, because even if they criticized a genocide in a relatively small country, that was inherently a benefit that was unique to our side, and that was like something which they could never claim under their side. So let's quickly look at the other like incentives we tell you in this debate. Secondly, we tell you it's about like reputation and social perception. We think that like often like sports had like a special like obligation to promote equality and fairness, which meant they wanted to like kind of enhance that image to keep up any like sponsorship and endorsements. And secondly, we think they get a lot of public backlash from like any bad human rights abuses. Thirdly, we thought another like incentive was their athletes. Often they were young people, often they were like people of color, and therefore to protect their athletes and to preserve this quality and like skill and like viewership of their sport, they had to kind of look after these people that were literally the thing that ran their sport and determined all their money and all their endorsements. So the opposition then wanted to bring up some like empirical examples, like the AFL didn't care about like adding goods. Firstly, we tell you this isolated example. It does not cover up for the fact they had very like few mechanisms. But note that under their side, the AFL would not even be able to support Adam Goods because that would be too political. So again, that was like a net harm on their side. So at the end of this, to be then we have to look at like therefore who these kind of sports like people target when they make their political statements. So we tell you, because the incentives I outlined before, they mostly cared about like human rights abuses. This for two reasons. Firstly, sport companies were more likely to care about social issues because they often had less explicit political experience, so were more likely to do something that was relatable and like easier to talk about. But secondly, they were often likely to do things that directly affected their athletes, who were often young people of color, etc. But secondly, they weren't likely to like give huge amounts of money to like the ALP, because that would be a really bad marketing strategy for them, right? Because like if they like started voting one of the major parties parties in every country, and they lose half their viewers in every country. So that clearly was a silly thing for them to do and would never be done by these kinds of like sporting corporations. The opposition tells you that this political involvement more looks like donations to like political parties. Again, we tell you that that's bad politics, and often it's like supporting a political party wasn't as like valuable to a sporting organization as making a moral and a political statement which would actively improve their image. Something that say like, oh, I wrote ALP, just like wouldn't have the same kind of moral prestige for. Okay, then we talk about power. So then what do we think is the power to implement this? So basically it was weird because in the early stages of the opposition, they kind of conceded that sport organizations had power because they're huge economy, IR, and people's awareness. We hear a really weird shift in the later parts of Third Defender's speech. Firstly, they say that like, it isolates the countries like North Korea who are cut up. We tell you, firstly, it gives them limited access to money, which can like be detrimental to their economies. And secondly, it shows no international support. So even that isolated example wasn't necessarily positive. We thought there were structural reasons why it was better than doing nothing. Secondly, it said say you don't know the human rights abuses if you don't hold the Olympics in those kinds of countries. However, clearly the whole point of making a stand is that it raises awareness and forces people to understand it. The whole point about boycotting like South African Olympics brought a huge amount of attention to apartheid and happened just before the apartheid system ended in that country. So clearly that was like shooting themselves in the foot there. Quickly, let's look into athletes. This wasn't an important part of their case because it just was not mutually exclusive. We tell you, especially at second, the opposition empowers individual athletes from speaking up. Firstly, because if sport organizations won't institutionally support them because they would be too political. Secondly, because it sends a message that sport is apolitical. And thirdly, if the sport organization does nothing, it seems like the athletes are contradicting them. That means they will not be able to do those kinds of things. As well as this, athletes are not as effective. They don't have as much money as huge multinational sports corporations. And even if they have like a big name, they're not as powerful. At the end of this, the opposition loses because they did not provide a path to victory and failed to be comparative about their own side in the debate. We tell you at the very least, we have the power to make a difference, something the opposition could never get. Thank you.
I thank the third negative speaker for that speech, and I thank all speakers for their speeches. The adjudicator, the panel is now going to go away into a breakout room while we make our decision. We'll be back with you in a few minutes. Okay, can we get everybody to turn their monitors back on? Thank you. Okay, so I'll get started. The first thing that I wanted to say to both sides is a massive congratulations on getting this far. That was a really good debate and all the adjudicators enjoyed it. The way I'm going to do the decision is first I'm going to give some general pieces of feedback. Then I'm going to do how I saw the result, how the panel saw the result, and then give the result at the end to keep you all in suspense. This is the final after all. So one brief piece of feedback. I think that the two teams in this debate were wedded to their own ideas of what the debate was about. So for the affirmative, the debate was about corruption and about stopping corruption by making sure that things like FIFA or the IOC had no involvement with countries like Qatar. For the negative, rather, this was about those organisations making political statements, whether that's either excluding certain countries, making statements about countries, or speaking up about important social issues internationally. Now, I think both sides kind of camped in those two places for the vast majority of the debate, and there wasn't a lot of kind of cross discussion or weighing of those two issues against each other until quite late in the debate. Once it becomes obvious that two sides are doing two quite different things in the debate, I think that the first thing that you want to do is basically simulate the debate on those two different terms. So think about, if you're the negative, how you might win the debate if it's about corruption, and how you win the debate if it's on your terms, and vice versa for the affirmative. I.e., deal with the debate in the worst possible world for you, and if you win both of them, there's no way that you're going to lose the debate. So I would just caution both sides to be a bit more generous. Though I think that the way that both sides did those individual issues was very good. So I'll start with the discussion. So I think the first major question that we had in the debate was, what sort of issues were we talking about? So what were national politics? So the affirmative say that it is corruption. They give largely two kind of veins of reasoning as to why getting involved in FIFA getting involved in national politics equaled corruption. The first was that taking bribes from dictators was in itself an act of political involvement. And the second was that those organizations have reasons to take bribes. That is because they have a corporate structure, because they have a head who is often not a kind of figurehead who is often not involved in sports, and they simply want cash. Now, I think that negative are able to do two things that respond to those two claims quite well. The first is that the negative are able to say that it's unclear why you can't stop corruption in a world where those organizations are still allowed to make political statements. There are other things that you can do to stop corruption, and also the mechanism for how the affirmatives world would achieve that was unclear. The second response, I think, from negative is to do with corporate incentives, and that is that media partners and sponsors of international events like the Olympics or the World Cup were likely to hold those organizations accountable, meaning that they could only be corrupt up to a certain point, and that also, even if they replicate corporate structures, corporations are generally speaking still care about their public perception. They care about their shareholders, and therefore they're not going to act in ways that are manifestly corrupt. Now, affirmative identify a lot of harms to corruption, things such as this means that you give more power to corrupt governments, for instance, Qatar, that people don't question whether it goes there, and therefore you get little accountability, that it delegitimised the competition, and athletes are less likely to play well because they are distracted by other political concerns. I think, however, the negative's style of responses is able to mitigate those harms, meaning that they don't come about, because I think they're able to effectively show that corruption is not going to necessarily occur as a result of stopping those organisations from making political statements relative to national politics. The negative's contrasting case says that political statements are important because they are the only means of counteracting the types of things that the affirmative thought would happen. So for instance, if you couldn't in the affirmatives world now say that Qatar is not going to get the World Cup for reasons to do with national politics because the body had to be, in all instances, apolitical. And that you also, once you had given those competitions to them, limited your own ability to then subsequently critique that decision or critique the national government or enforce standards upon that national government. So I think that they do a good job of framing the debate in those terms. More specifically, their analysis suggests that those sporting organisations are going to target kind of broader, less controversial issues. For instance, they point out things like genocide or human rights abuses, but they also talk about things that are kind of internationally important to athletes, things like the Me Too movement or Black Lives Matter. And I think that they do an effective job of pointing out that they were going to target only the most important issues. Secondly, they point out the power that organisations like FIFA or the IOC had, that is their links to media, the number of fans who tune into them, the profile that they have and that they're able to enforce through those competitions, as well as an obvious control over the member states because all those nations are members of the IOC or FIFA. So I think that they're able to say that they have power and they're going to focus on specific issues. And I think that they do have the negative display under questioning from affirmative a good humility about the change that would actually occur. They're not changing, claiming that they're going to be taking down dictatorships, rather that they were going to be able to force awareness in a way that simply might not be able to be done in such a popular setting. So they give the example traditionally, obviously, of apartheid South Africa and banning tournaments being played there, banning teams touring there. Now, the affirmative have a few responses to this. The first is to distinguish between athletes making political statements and sports organisations. They say that athletes are able to do it better because they have more influencers, more followers, and essentially you get rid of corruption, but you still retain athletes being able to make political statements. I think that the negative do a good job here of saying it's not either or. In our world, you get both. But also you don't get the circumstance that Colin Kaepernick found himself in, where you are butting heads up against an apolitical body who is not willing to support you for fear of being political, and therefore is not able to take action. Therefore, you're less empowered as an athlete to do that, and you're less likely to do that. And you're more likely to achieve change if you have both of those entities working in tandem. I thought that was a decent kind of response. The affirmative then have a couple other responses. The first is they say, well, China is not going to be critiqued by the IOC. It's only going to be smaller countries, and therefore it wasn't applied equally. The negative, I think, have a couple of good ways of responding to this. The first is they say that even if it isn't applied equally, it's still a good thing to be calling out things like massive human rights abuses or genocide or something similar, but also that they still would be able to criticize China because those organizations gain a lot of power from their other member states who might support them in that, for instance, whether that's the US or Europe, and that would operate in both directions. The second claim that we get from affirmative as to why the types of political statements we get from sports organizations were going to be bad was that they simply have bad politics. And they point to the example of the AFL, obviously a national organization rather than a global one, and Adam Goodes. I think that the negative point out here, well, at second and third, that those organizations simply would not be able to support Adam Goodes in that situation. So they had, or despite the incentives that act upon them in order to take on big important issues like racism, that in this world they would be doing virtually nothing, and therefore would be the equivalent of what the affirmative claims they don't want. So overall, I think that the negative do a better job of minimizing the affirmative's case about corruption, and the negative build up a really good case for why political statements are going to be important. On top of that, I think that they have some good material about why this was principally important and also why this would, in people's perceptions, disentangle sport from politics in a quite nasty way. And for that reason, overall, unanimously, we gave this debate to the negative. But congratulations to both sides, and you should all be very proud of yourselves. Shall we do fourth speaker speeches?
Hi, we'd just like to say a really massive thank you to the opposition. It was a really interesting and tough debate, and you guys did really well. We'd also like to thank the three adjudicators for being here, and yeah, just thank you.
We'd also like to say thank you to the opposition for putting up a really challenging debate. We wish you luck in your future debates. Also, thanks to the Edges for coming out, for anybody watching this tonight. And of course, a massive thanks to our incredible coach, Oliver, who we would be nothing without.